The pipe burst at the worst possible time. Steam filled the lower engine corridor of the ardent sky in seconds, thick and white and loud enough to drown out the alarm that followed it. Two Vothrani engineers stumbled back from the pressure valve, their 6 limbs scrambling against the wet floor, their wide amber eyes blinking in the heat. One of them grabbed a repair tool and held it like he was not sure what to do with it. The other one just stood there. Nora Voss had already moved past both of them. She did not run. She did not shout. She walked at the kind of speed that people use when they have done something 100 times in places where panic is a death sentence. She pulled the manual bypass lever from the wall mount, cranked it twice to the left, hit the secondary valve seal with the flat of her palm, and held it shut while the pressure dropped. 40 seconds, maybe less. The steam began to thin. She stepped back, wiped her hand on her jacket, and looked at the seal. It would hold. The two Vothrani engineers stared at her. Neither of them said anything. One of them eventually turned and walked away to file a maintenance report. The other one looked at the patch valve, then at Nora, then also walked away. Nora picked up her water bottle from where she had set it on the floor before moving to the pipe. She drank from it and kept walking. That was her second week on the ardent sky. She had been assigned to the vessel through a routine union labor placement. Her file said Grade C. It said General Maintenance and Support Duties. It said she had experience in basic systems work. It did not say much else. The Vothrani crew had read the file, noted the grade, and pointed her toward the lower decks. That was the end of their interest in her. The Ardent Sky was a council diplomatic vessel, long and gray, built for function over comfort. It carried a crew of 40, mostly Vothrani, with a handful of Yeth observers and 2 humans, Nora and a man named Draven, placed on the same labor rotation 3 months before her. Draven was easy to find. He was the loudest person in the mess hall. He had a wide face, a missing tooth on the lower left, and the kind of cheerfulness that comes from a man who decided the world was going to be hard and he might as well enjoy it anyway. Nora sat down across from him the evening after the pipe incident. He looked at her hands. There was a faint red mark across her right palm where she had pressed the valve seal. He looked at it for a second and did not comment. "We are heading toward Durith 7, he said instead, quietly, in a way people speak when they do not want the table next to them to understand the words even if they can hear the sounds. Nora picked up her fork. "I know. You read the routing file. I read the engine output schedules. The fuel load. The trajectory curve." She took a bite of the protein block on her tray. It tasted like nothing in particular. You do not need the routing file if you read everything around it. Draven was quiet for a moment. Across the mess hall, a group of 3 Vothrani officers were eating together and looking at something on a shared datapad. One of them glanced toward the human table, said something in Vothrani, and the other 2 made the sound that passed for laughter among their species. A low, clicking rattle in the back of the throat. Nora did not look up from her tray. "Do you know what is on Durith 7? Draven asked. "A civilization," she said. "Pre-contact. Bipedal, for what the old survey data suggests. Maybe 200,000 individuals across the northern continent." She paused, in a private resource interest that does not want them there. Draven set down his fork. "You got all of that from the engine output schedules, and the communications lag pattern, and the way the senior staff started eating faster 3 days ago." She looked at him for the first time. People always eat faster when they are worried about a timeline. He looked at her for a long moment. He had known her real history from before the union placement, from before the file was scrubbed of anything that might make a council crew treat her differently. He had been the one who suggested she keep it that way. He was starting to wonder how long that would last. "They are not going to listen to you," he said. "You know that." "I know. Even if something goes wrong out there. Even if the timeline breaks and Orith moves early and everything falls apart. They're going to look at your grade, and they're going to look at your file, and they're going to try to solve the problem themselves first. I know that too." He picked his fork back up. "Just wanted to make sure." At the other end of the mess hall, the 3 officers laughed again. One of them looked toward the human table a second time. Nora had already looked away. In the far corner near the door, a young Vothrani officer named Suri sat alone with her personal log open beside her tray. She had been standing near the corridor entrance when the pipe burst. She had seen Nora move through the steam before the alarm had even finished its first cycle. She wrote in her log, "The human moved like she has done this before. In worse places." She stared at the words for a moment. Then she closed the log and finished her meal in silence. 3 days out from Durith, 7, Galvex called a crew briefing. The main meeting room on the Ardent Sky was not large, but it felt large when Galvex stood in it. He was tall even by Vothrani standards, with 6 limbs and the kind of stillness that senior officers develop after decades of being the most important person in every room. He had pale green skin, ridge marks along his jaw that indicated rank, and no patience for anything that was not directly useful to him. He opened the briefing without ceremony. A rogue mercenary faction called the Guttrander Group had been contracted by an unnamed private union interest to clear Durith, 7, for resource extraction. Their commander was a Wethkai named Orith. The council had become aware of the contract 3 weeks ago. The Ardent Sky had been dispatched to establish diplomatic authority over the planet before Orith could act. The mission was simple: arrive, assert jurisdiction, file the protection order, and leave. Galvex spoke for 12 minutes. His officers asked 7 questions. He answered 5 of them. Nora stood at the back of the room near the door. She had not been invited to the briefing. She had been walking past the room when the door opened and a Yeth observer had waved everyone in. She had simply not left. Nobody had told her to go. Nobody had looked at her long enough to tell her anything. She listened to every word. She watched the tactical display on the wall behind Galvex. She looked at the projected arrival times, the orbital approach window, the estimated position of Orith's ship. She did the math in her head, the way she had been trained to do it years ago in places far from here. She did not like the numbers. Orith was already close. When the briefing ended and the room began to empty, Nora stayed where she was until Draven found her in the corridor outside. "Well," he said, "Galvex thinks Orith will wait for the diplomatic window to close before acting," she said. "He believes Orith will not want to operate in direct view of a council vessel. And you think?" "I think Orith has cleared 14 worlds. I think a man who does that does not become careful. He becomes faster." She started walking. Galvex has never dealt with a contractor like Orith. He is treating this like a legal dispute. Orith is treating it like a job. Draven fell in a step beside her. What does the timeline look like if Orith moves early? It falls apart completely. That evening, Suri found Nora in the lower deck storage bay, reorganizing crates that did not need reorganizing. Suri stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her, and then stepped inside. "You were in the briefing room," Suri said. "The door was open. You're grade C labor. That briefing was for operations staff." Nora lifted a crate and set it on a shelf. "Do you want me to apologize for listening?" Suri was quiet for a moment. She had a careful face, the kind that gave very little away. She was younger than most of the officers on the ship, recently promoted, still figuring out what kind of officer she wanted to be. "You were watching the tactical display the entire time," she said. "Not Galvex. The display. The display had the useful information. What did you see in it?" Nora stopped and looked at her. It was a direct question, asked plainly, without the usual edge of someone trying to catch her out. She decided to answer it the same way. "Orith's ship entered this sector 6 days ago. The briefing said he arrived 3 days ago. That means he spent 3 days running quiet before we knew he was here. That is not a man waiting for a legal window. That is a man who was already in position before we knew he was moving." She turned back to the crates. "Galvex's timeline assumes Orith is responding to the council. I think Orith stopped caring about the council a long time ago." Suri stood very still. "I should report this to Commander Galvex." "You should," Nora agreed. "He will probably not enjoy hearing it from a grade C laborer. He would not enjoy hearing it from anyone." There was a small silence. Somewhere in the ship above them, a ventilation fan cycled through its rotation. Nora stacked another crate. Suri had not left. "Your file," Suri said carefully. "The access level on some sections is higher than it should be for the grade listed." Nora said nothing. "I tried to open one of the restricted sections. It required a clearance code I do not have." She paused. "I'm a senior access officer on this vessel. There should not be sections of a grade C labor file that I cannot open. Nora set the last crate in place and turned around. Then I suppose you will need a higher clearance code. Suri looked at her for a long moment. Then she nodded once and left. Nora waited until her footsteps faded. Then she sat down on one of the crates and looked at the ceiling. Draven appeared from behind a shelf at the back of the bay. He had been there the whole time. She's going to keep pulling at it, he said. I know, Nora said. That is fine. Is it? She thought about the numbers on the tactical display. The 3 days Orith had spent running quiet. The distance between where he was now and where Durith 7 was. We're going to need someone on the inside of this crew who is paying attention, she said. She is already paying attention. Draven leaned against the shelf. You left it findable on purpose, didn't you? The file. Nora stood up and walked toward the door. Get some sleep. We are 2 days out. The alert came at the wrong hour, which is when alerts usually come. Nora was in the lower corridor running a routine check on a water filtration unit when the ship's emergency channel opened and Galvex's voice came through, flat and tight, and stripped of everything except the words themselves. Orith's vessel, the Gutrinder, had dropped out of transit ahead of schedule. Not by hours, by 2 full days. It was already in orbit around Durith 7, and its forward units were already moving toward the surface. The diplomatic timeline was gone. By the time Nora reached the operations deck, Galvex had assembled his senior officers, and the room was already loud. Not panic, but close to it. 3 officers were talking at once. One was running projections on the display screen that kept updating and getting worse. Another was trying to reach the council relay and getting nothing back except delay notifications. Galvex stood in the middle of it, still and tall, and he was thinking. She could see that. He was not a foolish man. He was a careful one. But careful and fast are not the same thing, and right now the situation needed fast. Nora stood at the back of the room. She was not supposed to be there. She was grade C labor. This was an operations briefing during an active emergency. Nobody had stopped her because nobody had looked at her. The proposals came fast. Send a hardline diplomatic signal and demand Orith stand down. It would take time, and Orith would ignore it. Accelerate to intercept and position the ardent sky between Orith and the planet. The ardent sky was a diplomatic vessel, not a warship, and Orith knew it. Request emergency backup from the nearest council military post. The nearest post was 11 days out. Each proposal landed and was taken apart within minutes. The room kept circling the same problem from different angles and arriving at the same answer. They were not in a good position. Draven had found his way to the doorway. He leaned against the frame and looked at Nora from across the room. She looked back at him. He raised one eyebrow. She shook her head slightly. Not yet. One of the officers, a heavy-set Vothrani named Galt, turned toward the back of the room to grab something from a shelf and noticed Nora standing there. He stared at her. Why is the human in here? Several heads turned. Galvex looked at her for the first time. His expression did not change exactly, but something behind his eyes shifted into a sharper focus. Grade C labor, he said. This is a restricted briefing. I know, Nora said. Then you should leave. Draven spoke from the doorway. His voice was easy and unhurried, the way it got when he had decided something. She has been listening to your proposals for 10 minutes. She has not interrupted. She has not asked for anything. The reason she has not left is the same reason I have not left. He looked at Galvex directly. Because you're running out of options, and you know it, and you have someone standing in the back of this room who has done exactly this kind of work before. A short silence. The projection on the display updated again. The numbers got worse. She is grade C, Galvex said. Her file shows basic maintenance experience. Then let Suri tell you what the rest of the file shows. Every head in the room turned towards Suri. Suri had known this moment was coming since the night in the storage bay. She had spent the 2 days since then pulling every thread she could find, using every access contact she had, working her way into sections of a file that should not have existed at that clearance level at all. What she had found had not let her sleep well. She stood up straight. She looked at Galvex. She read 3 lines aloud from her personal data pad. The room went quiet, not the quiet of an empty space. The quiet of a room full of people who have just been asked to recalculate something they thought they already understood. Galvex looked at Nora. He looked at her the way people look at objects that have suddenly revealed themselves to be something different from what the label said. Nora did not move. She did not change her expression. She waited. The Reach initiative was dissolved. Galvex said finally. Officially, it does not exist. A lot of things that exist have been officially dissolved, Nora said. The people who went through the program still went through it. Another silence. On the display, the Gutrender's position updated. Ortha's units were 40 minutes from the settlement coordinates. Galvex looked at his officers. He looked at the display. He looked at Nora. "What do you need?" he said. She had already been thinking about it. She answered without hesitation. 2 hours before we reach orbit. A drop suit rated for high heat entry. Long-range signal relay equipment, and someone I trust to operate it from a secondary drop point. She paused. "And whoever you can spare that is not afraid of the dark." Galvex stared at her for a long moment. Then he turned to his officers. "Get her what she needs." Nobody laughed this time. The entry was not clean. It was never going to be. A clean entry meant a tracked entry. An attract entry meant Ortha's orbital scanners would have a location fix on her before she reached the tree line. So Nora came in at the wrong angle, bleeding heat across the entry cone in a long diagonal that looked like debris scatter on a passive scan. The drop suit shook so hard during the first 90 seconds that she could not read the altimeter. She did not need to. She had done this in worse conditions, in darker places, over terrain that had no name on any official map. She hit the canopy at low altitude and let the suit's brake system do the work. She landed in deep forest. Dark, wet, tangled with root systems that rose above her knees in places. The air smelled like iron and something sweet she could not identify. Durith 7's gravity was slightly heavier than Earth's standard, which she had accounted for. Her knees knew the difference anyway. She pulled the canopy down, buried it under a root cluster, and spent 40 seconds being completely still. No sound except the forest. She moved. Draven had been dropped 3 kilometers north. His job was the signal relay, patch the Ardent Sky's diplomatic frequency into Ortha's command channel when she told him to. It was a technical job. He was good at it. She had stopped worrying about his part of this the moment they talked through it on the ship. Her part was the terrain. She found Ortha's forward scout team in 20 minutes. 8 Wethkai mercs in heavy equipment, moving through the forest in a spread formation toward the first settlement coordinates. They were good. Professional. They moved quietly for their size, and they kept their intervals tight. They were also moving through a forest they had never been in before, on a world they had studied from orbit, following approach lines drawn by someone sitting in a ship far above the canopy. Nora had spent the 2 hours before the drop studying everything available on Durith 7's terrain. Soil type, water drainage patterns, dominant tree species, and root density. She had asked Suri to pull the old survey data, the deep scans, the geological maps. Suri had pulled all of it without asking why. She moved parallel to the scout team, 50 meters to their east, staying in the heaviest root cover. She was not trying to engage them. She was trying to reach their communications relay unit before they reached the settlement. The relay was being carried by the second Wethkai in the formation, a large box on a back harness, running a steady signal pulse up to the Gutrender. It was what connected Ortha's ground units to his ship. Without it, the ground units were isolated. They could still complete their mission, but Orth could not coordinate them, could not redirect them, could not pull them back in real time. Getting to it without being seen required crossing the scout team's path at a point where 2 of the 8 mercs would be briefly out of visual contact with each other. She had been watching their intervals for 10 minutes. She knew when the gap would come. It came. She crossed in 6 seconds, low and fast through a depression in the route line, reached the relay carrier from behind, detached the power coupling from the bottom of the harness box with 2 clean pulls, and was back in the tree cover before the nearest Wethkai completed his next step. No sound. No alarm. The relay carrier kept walking. He would not know the box was dead until someone tried to use it. Nora moved northeast toward the settlement. She found it an hour later, in a wide clearing edged by tall gray-bark trees. The structures were low and built from the same gray wood, 100 of them at least, with narrow paths between them. Fires, voices, children somewhere, the smell of cooked food. And at the edge of the clearing, watching her approach, a group of 12 individuals who were clearly guards. They held long tools that were not quite spears. They were tall, gray-skinned, with 4 eyes arranged in a slight arc across broad foreheads. They did not run. They did not attack. They stood and watched. Nora stopped at the edge of the tree line. She put down the equipment bag she was carrying. She set down the signal unit. She held up both empty hands, palms out, and then she sat down in the dirt. She did not speak. She did not gesture. She sat with her hands visible and her eyes slightly down, and she waited. This was not a technique from any manual. It was something she had learned in the barren zones, dealing with communities who had been burned by outsiders enough times that words meant nothing and actions meant everything. The guards watched her for a long time. Then one of them, older, with a walking staff carved with symbols, came forward. He stopped 3 meters from her and looked at her for a long, careful moment. Then he sat down too. Aboard the ardent sky, Suri was watching Nora's biosign feed. Her hands were pressed flat on the console. Galvex stood behind her, watching the same screen. "She is sitting down," Suri said, "on the ground, in front of them." Galvex said nothing for a moment. Then, quietly, "She is negotiating." The elder and the human sat in the dirt at the edge of the forest for 30 minutes. When Nora stood up again, the elder stood with her. He pointed into the settlement and then pointed north, along a path Nora could not have known about from any map. She picked up her bag and followed the direction he had given her. The guards parted to let her through. Orth landed on Durith, 7 at midday. He came down in a command shuttle with 12 soldiers around him and 18 more already on the ground ahead of him. 30 in total. All Wethkai, all veterans, all carrying equipment that cost more than most Union ships paid their crews in a year. He had done this 30 times on 14 worlds. He knew what it looked like when a job was clean and when it was not. This one had stopped feeling clean an hour ago. His forward relay had gone silent. Not damaged, not jammed, just dead, which was the strange part. His lead scout had reported no contact, no ambush, nothing unusual in the forest. The relay had simply stopped sending. Things that simply stopped were either broken or someone had touched them, and his equipment did not break. He stood at the edge of the first clearing his team had located and looked at the tree line across from him. The forest was quiet, not the quiet of an empty place. The quiet of a place that was being quiet on purpose. He had felt this before. Not often. Twice, maybe. Both times it had cost him something. "Spread and advance," he said. His soldiers moved out in a wide formation, disciplined and fast. They were not afraid of forests. They were not afraid of much. They had numbers, equipment, and the full contract authority of a private union interest behind them. What they did not have was a clear picture of where the problem was coming from, and in Ortha's experience, that was the only thing that ever truly mattered. The first sign was the navigation units. 2 soldiers in the East Wing reported their ground positioning units were feeding them a looped coordinate signal, the same position repeating every 6 seconds instead of updating. Not jammed, looped. Someone had found the local positioning anchor they had placed on arrival and fed it a false cycle. The East Wing had been walking in a slow curve for 20 minutes without knowing it. Orth pulled them back and reset. The second sign was the power cells. 3 of his soldiers in the Western group found their weapon systems drawing down to low power without being fired. Not drained, reduced. Someone had accessed the external charge ports on their equipment while they were moving and set the draw limiters to bleed the cells slowly. It required getting close enough to touch the equipment without being seen. Orth stood very still for a moment. He looked at the tree line again. He had 30 soldiers. He had air support on standby from the Gutrender above. He had a clear contract and a clear mission. And somewhere in this forest, one person was taking his operation apart one piece at a time without ever showing herself, without a single shot, without a single noise his people could track. He was starting to understand why the council file on this target had been sealed at a level he had not been able to access. He opened his command channel to the gut trender. Static. He tried again. More static, and then, cutting through it clearly, a voice. Not one of his. A Vothrani voice. Calm and formal. Reading the full text of a Union planetary protection ordered directly into his command frequency. Behind it, barely audible, he could hear the broader council relay opening, which meant this transmission was not just going to him. It was going to every ship in the sector with a receiver tuned to Union emergency band, which meant the council now had a live record of exactly where his ship was, exactly what his ground units were doing, and exactly which private interest contract code was attached to the operation. He stood in the clearing for a long moment. His mission was to clear this world quietly, quickly, and without official record. It was supposed to be finished before anyone with authority arrived to object. That was the whole design of the job. Every part of that design was now gone. "Pull back," he said. His voice was steady. He was angry, but he was not foolish, and only a fool continued a job when the job had become something else entirely. All units, back to the shuttle. Now, his soldiers were professionals. They did not argue. They moved. What Orith thought about, as the shuttle lifted and the trees fell away below him, was the shape of what had just happened. He had come in with 30 soldiers, full equipment, and a contract signed at the highest private level in the Union. And he had been taken apart, not by a fleet, not by a military response, not by anything he could point to on a map, by one person moving through a forest she had never been in before, using nothing except what she knew and what she had prepared. He opened a new channel. He needed to know who had been on that council ship. His contact took 4 minutes. The answer was a name he did not recognize, a rank he did not recognize, and a program designation that his contact told him, in a careful voice, he should not ask about again. Orith looked out the viewport as Durith, 7, fell away. He had never retreated from a job this fast. He had never been given a reason to before. He made a note in his private log and closed the channel. The mess hall of the Ardent Sky smelled the same as it always did. Recycled air, something warm from the food station. The faint hum of the ventilation system doing its quiet work above the ceiling panels. Nora sat at the same table she always sat at, with the same tray in front of her, and ate in the same silence she had kept since the first day she came aboard. The difference was that Suri sat down across from her without being asked. She set her tray down and sat like it was something she had always done. No explanation. She just picked up her fork. Nora glanced at her, then looked back at her tray. Draven arrived 2 minutes later, dropped into the seat beside Nora, and immediately began talking about something that had nothing to do with Durith, 7, or Orith, or any of it. A story about a cargo dispatcher on a station he had worked 3 years ago, told entirely for its own sake, with no point except that it was funny. By the end of it, Suri was making the low clicking sound that passed for laughter among Vothrani. Nora was quiet, but she was not closed. That was a difference people who knew her could see. Galvex's report had been filed 2 days after Orith's departure from Durith 7. Nora had not read it. She had not needed to. She could tell from the way the senior staff moved around her in the corridors. Careful now, aware, not dismissive, that what Galvex had written had changed her standing in ways that no one had officially announced. Orith was facing a union tribunal. The private interest behind his contract had been identified, named, and referred to the council's legal division. Durith, 7 had been placed under protected status, which meant no extraction contracts could be issued without a full council vote. The people in the Greywood settlement would wake up the same way they always had, not knowing how close the edge had been. Suri asked the question while Draven was getting seconds from the food station. "How did you learn all of it?" she said. "Not just the tactics. The other part. Sitting down. Waiting. The way you were with the Elder." Nora thought about it for a moment. "Earth is not a gentle world," she said. "It has not been for a long time. The barren zones, the collapsed coasts, people born in those places had to learn how to read situations that could go wrong very fast. When to speak and when to be still. When to show strength and when to show you are not a threat. You do not learn that from a manual. You learn it because the alternative is that you do not come home." Suri was quiet for a moment. "Is that what the Reach initiative trained?" "That. The initiative gave us the technical side, the equipment, the entry systems, the field tactics. Nora shook her head slightly. But the part that actually works, the part that made the elders sit down, that came from before any program. That came from growing up somewhere that did not forgive mistakes. Are all humans like this? Nora looked at her. No, most humans are not like this. She paused. Some of them are better. Suri seemed to consider this for a while. Then she said very carefully, Galvex asked me this morning what it would take to have a standing human field advisor attached to council diplomatic missions. Nora said nothing. I told him I did not know. He told me to find out. Draven came back with his tray, sat down, and looked between the two of them. What did I miss? Nothing yet, Nora said. A message had arrived that morning through the diplomatic channel. It had come from the surface of Durith 7, relayed through the Protection Orders communication node, which was the only active channel between the planet and the outside until the Council completed its filing. The message was not text. It was a small package, logged and clear by the customs officer, now sitting on the table beside Nora's tray. She opened it. Inside was a carved token, small enough to sit in the center of her palm. Gray wood, smooth, shaped into something that was almost a circle, but not quite. One side curved inward like a hand cupping something. The carving was precise and deliberate. It had taken time. Draven leaned over to look at it. His voice, when he spoke, was quieter than usual. What does it mean? I do not know exactly, Nora said, but I know what it is for. She had seen equivalents before, in the barren zones, in places where people gave each other things instead of words because they had learned that words could be taken back. It means someone stood between them and what was coming. She closed her fingers around it. It means they know. Draven looked at his tray. He did not say anything, but his jaw moved in the way it did when he was keeping something behind his teeth. Suri looked at the token for a long moment and then looked away. In the corridor outside the mess hall, Galvex walked past the open door. He slowed for just a moment when he saw the three of them at the table. He saw Draven with his head down, Suri sitting where she never used to sit, and Nora with something small and wooden held in her closed hand. He kept walking. He did not go back to what he had said weeks ago, standing in his own briefing room, when he had seen her grade on a file and decided he already knew everything he needed to know. He did not say what he was thinking now, but he did not laugh either.